1 Corinthians chapter 11. I failed miserably last time because I got all the way through, and then there was verse 34 at the bell, just hanging there, mocking me. So, to properly understand what we're doing, though, that means that we need to kind of go through, and I thought it would be wiser to kind of walk us through the whole thing of this big section, so we get to verse 34, and then we'll introduce the next section after that. So when you come through and you look at 1 Corinthians, it's divided into two sections, two main sections. The first 6 chapters are addressing 2 major problems. The first was one of division, that's covered in chapters 1 through 4, as Paul walks them through the evidence of division that are among them, and then the reason why they are having it in chapter 2 is they're failing to respond to inspiration, and that they instead are focusing on individuals. And that's why chapter 3 is there, and that they need to realize what God had made possible as he describes them as being his work, his building, his people, his temple, all these things as a result. And then in chapter 4, he finishes off this argument by saying, I've transferred all these things in figure to myself and Apollos, but I'm really talking about you. Apollos and I don't have these difficulties with one another. That's not what this is about. The problem is some of you are setting yourselves up as far as being kind of these group leaders and clique leaders of the congregation, and you're creating a problem. So he wants to take care of that. And then beginning in chapter 5 rather, he introduces the problem of the man who had taken his father's wife and the correct way to handle that. He showed that they had handled it the wrong way by just, fine, everything's good, nothing to see here, and instead directed them toward church discipline. Matter of fact, you see in beginning in chapter 6, the likelihood of what's going on is that because the church wasn't doing anything, then the man wronged had taken it to the secular courts, and he says, that's not how you solve this either. I was like, you're just basically airing all the problems instead of going through and handling a spiritual problem in spiritual ways. And as he walks you through down there, and he says, look, we were all in this kind of situation at one time. He reminds them, verses 9 through 11 of chapter 6, of their past state, of past sin, and he emphasizes in that the problems of fornication, which were the main center of what the man had done. And that led him in then in what followed to talk about the problem itself of sexual immorality and to why that needs to be overcome and addressed. So division, so you have basically a doctrinal division, social division, and then immorality as being 2 main problems in the congregation. But when you turn into chapter 7, he begins answering these questions that they had. And in chapter 7, you essentially have 2 types of questions, both around marriage. The one is about those who are already married, and then the second section is about those who would like to get married. And he addresses all the questions that they would have. Very practical questions for very young Christians at this time. And in these questions, he introduces it with the idea of now concerning. So when you get to chapter 8, we see this now concerning, verse 1, things offered to idols. And I've brought this up multiple times now in recent weeks because you do not see another now concerning until chapter 12 and verse 1. So what that tells us, if we're understanding the structure of the book, is that really chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11 are all one major section. And they are related to this larger question about the problems introduced from society. So in chapter 8, he addresses how they needed to make sure that these things offered to idols, they had the proper view of it, that the things offered to idols themselves, that was not the problem. It had to do with the perception and the influence if we persisted in doing things that looked as if we were participating in something that was itself wrong, and that we needed to be aware of our influence both toward our brethren and those who are weak in the faith, and toward those who are not Christians, lest they think we approve of things because of their misunderstanding. So it's something about your own understanding needs to be right, but there's more to consider than that. It's also the way people around you understand it and how you want to have the best influence. So then you go into chapter 9. In chapter 9, we think, well, this is kind of odd. Paul just talks about himself for a whole chapter. But in reality, what he does is he takes that same principle that he had established in chapter 8 and verse 13 of talking about he would do this himself. He would committed that he would never eat meat again if that's what was required. So in chapter 9, he gives examples of how he had, for the sake of his ministry, stepped away from doing things that were perfectly right and perfectly acceptable for him to do. And we specifically think about the getting married. Stepped away from that. And you see it kind of, the main verse is found in verses around 22 and 23, where he talks about that to the Jews he became as a Jew, and to the Greeks he became as a Greek. The whole point, it's still the same idea. I am going to make the adjustment myself rather than cause a problem for anyone. And he explains why he wants those souls to be saved. And therefore, in verses 23 through 27 of that chapter, he disciplines himself. And it's interesting that we don't see it this way. We think he's just talking about sin. But he's also talking about, in chapter 9, 23 through 27, he brings himself under great discipline, not only to do things that are simply right, but things that are best for the souls he's wanting to reach. And that sometimes that means not doing some things that are perfectly acceptable, but that might cause problems for the souls around him. So it's still developing this idea. Now, to show that he hasn't lost that context, in chapter 10, he comes back, but now he's doing an historical background where he walks them through a little bit of Hebrew history, especially around the problem of idolatry, of getting caught up in that. And so what he's now coming down and saying, look, it's not anything. Those things aren't real. But those things can come back and get you as a form of religion, and you need to be careful lest you fall back into it like they did, which is why he said they are there for an example, verse 11, and that we do not need to be proud about it, thinking, oh, we're better than that, that'll never happen to us. Verse 12, yes, it will. So verse 13, these are normal kind of problems we run into. So then he picks up, we'll go back to chapter 10 and verse 14, and therefore he says again, my brethren, flee from idolatry. So it's still on that same major theme of these outside forces, how they can affect us as Christians, and we need to be aware of that. And he immediately then foreshadows the discussion in chapter 11 by talking about the Lord's Supper, beginning in verse 16 of chapter 10. But then it's about fellowship. So he's discussing about the problem of coming over here and partaking of it, but it's, do we really know what we're doing, or are we treating it the same way we would if we were doing something for some pagan idol in the past? So he's introduced that idea, and then he comes down in verse 23 of chapter 10, which continues all the way through chapter 11, verse 1, and he's talking about why we should be doing things, that we don't just do things because we can. We want to make sure, in his theme, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. That is, again, the same theme. It's the recognition that within the framework of what God has provided and what he says is okay, there are still limitations based upon our care for others. That is, I am not going to push the fact that I absolutely can do this if it's going to create another problem for people spiritually. And so he continues to go through that of being respectful of others' conscience. Now, that has to do with individual actions. That does not mean that we are to place ourselves now at the mercy of one person's conscience for congregational behavior, but that we need to be mindful of that. If it's something that would cause someone to be lost, it certainly deserves that kind of attention. And therefore, in doing this, he says at the close of that section, imitate me just as I imitate Christ. Christ did the same thing. He was doing all about what it took to save souls. He then gives two examples. specific examples. He's been developing these principles. The first had to do with that broad idea of the idols, and then he drops off to look at it, apply it to himself in things that were particular to him as a preacher. He then comes down and applies it generally to idolatry, same idea, and then establishes those principles in a consistent way. He then applies it in one way to the problem of the women wearing veils. And we noted at the time the difference when you see in verse 2, he begins by saying, "Now I praise you, brethren." That's important for what we're going to see in just a moment, that they are involved in keeping these traditions. So he's now providing an example of something that could be a problem there, that he does not want to become a problem, but he uses it as a teaching, as a reference, and he describes in various ways why they should respect the wearing of a veil. It applies all of these principles. That is, it is not something that was to be applied universally, as he points out at the end of that section in verse 16, but rather it was something that within basic, and it was cultural, not just within worship, it was generally true, as we see of what respect. The principles were around respecting people, respecting the culture, and also maintaining the right kind of other principle, which had to do with the roles of men and women, which he established in verse 3, which he brought in Christ and the relationship of Christ to God to show that this is about role, not identity and value. So having done that first and described why you need to respect this, but that doesn't mean this is some kind of new law that everyone needs to. It's you applying the principles of respect for the culture and the people, for the benefits, so they get the right idea about Christianity, not the wrong idea by you saying, well, in Christians, we don't have to do this. But they're going to get the idea that you're rebellious and that you don't submit and all these problems. They're going to get the wrong idea by you're doing that, so don't do that. But then we came down and we looked at chapter 11, beginning in verse 17. And now, in contrast to verse 2, it says, "Now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse." And so what we find here is this is still in that context. He is connecting, by contrast, what he had said about the women wearing the veils and the problem of the Lord's Supper as being specific examples of this principle. If you remember, I pointed out that verse 16 of chapter 11, that it ends the section of the veils, is connected to chapter 10 and verse 32 of giving no offense in principle. So all of these things, by using the principle, he is interweaving them together so that now we get to this point of how he's bringing up what is a big issue that he's been leading them toward. He's been foreshadowing it. He's been providing the principles. And now he's developed this problem of why do you have this problem and what does it look like to anybody? The problem was the influence of their past life in idolatry and also connecting to their problem of division that he addressed in chapters 1 through 4. So this then divides up the first section, verses 17 through 22, very important for what we're going to get to in the last verse. He establishes here are the problems that they had. They were not waiting around. This division was showing up in the assembly, in that people would come together, get in their own little groups. As soon as their group arrived, they do their thing. They're then gone. Somebody else comes up. And so it was all very just kind of thrown together. You were your own group. It was not united as a congregation, doing something the congregation should do to unite and display their unity and why they are Christians. Their identity was then based upon social things of this little group, and that was demonstrated in that they did not want to wait around for anybody else outside their social group. So their identity was far more social than it was spiritual, or else they would identify with their other brethren too. Okay? So that was the big issue. Verses 23 through 26 then, he refers to the institution of the Lord's Supper. So we talked about the difference between, he now goes back to the institution of it by Jesus on the night on which he was betrayed. He refers to that, here's the standard by which you should be doing this. He had introduced it, here are the problems you currently have, and now we're going to fix those problems. That is, we're going to regulate it. So he's not reinstituting it. Those things are already in place. It's why he doesn't mention the time. He refers to it as many times as, but he wasn't giving them that time. They already knew it. As we see in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, it's on the first day of the week. So then you pick up in verse 24, verse 27, after the institution 23 through 26, and now he is going to provide the regulations to fix the problems that he saw and mentioned and admonished them for in verses 17 through 22. So in doing this, it was to meet up to their failures and to say, here's what it's taking to fix this problem. They needed to make sure they're considering themselves and their attitude, in their mindset. Are you examining yourselves? That you're doing it for the right purpose. Verse 29. He's saying, verse 30, that they are creating a larger problem in the congregation, and that this is evidence of it, spiritual weakness. And then as he comes down to verse 31, 32, and talking about being judged, it says the whole purpose of, you wouldn't be judged here and feel bad about what I'm saying if you did it right the first time. That wouldn't be an issue if you could get it down. So verse 33 then is important because he now comes back to the original thing he mentioned. Now this is operating as kind of the whole of the problem, which had to do with their attitude toward it, that it was serving the wrong purpose. It was just their little group getting together, doing their thing for social reasons without having their mind set on what the purpose of the Lord's Supper is. So what does he do then? Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. That's the first problem. So that's the direct thing. He'd already told them several things personally to do, but now in regard to one another, wait for one another. This is to be a congregational thing. Now, they were turning everything into private, okay, by choice. They were intentionally kind of saying, okay, we're the congregation, but then we don't do anything nothing we do is saying that we're a congregation. It's saying we're not. And so, and how we go about this, we need to just be mindful that what we're trying to do is this God designed to be something that we're making a statement that we are His. We are making a statement of faith about what Jesus did. Remember that He came, that is in the incarnation, and in the sacrificial death, and by implication, and continue to do this, that He was raised from the dead, and that this then is a core idea of proclaiming the centrality of Jesus and what He accomplished as being the foundation for everything else we do, and therefore everything we are as Christians. It's that close to identity. And when you don't treat it like that and to bring everyone together on that basis, there's a failing. Because it should be on the first day of the week, the Lord's Supper is designed to be the most unifying thing you do. Now we do other things that are to be done in unity. We should pray together. We should sing with one another together. We're here to listen to the same message. We come on the first day of the week. It's a little bit different, but you're also giving to put into a general collection that is the congregations. Okay, but the primary thing that even the timing of is based upon this. And in doing that, it is a weekly proclamation of this is who we are. This, Jesus is real, Jesus really came, Jesus really died, Jesus really rose, Jesus is really coming again. These are fundamental to what we believe and what make us who we are. And that is what we are proclaiming to one another. And when we treat it, the Lord's Supper, and say, I don't, this is no big deal, or I can skip a week, no big deal, we're not appreciating what it is really trying to accomplish by God's design. So that brings us to verse 34, in which he says, but if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment. And the rest I will set in order when I come. Now we're showing he's got another part that he wants to address. He's already addressed the individual responsibility of the mindset. Now he is addressing the environment, which is to be a congregational environment. Okay, why? To bring us together. All that can come together should come together. And then he says, and if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home. This has to do with purpose. So he has dealt with your attitude, he's dealt with your environment, and now he's dealing with your purpose. And that these all need to come together in order to be right. This reference to what he says the earlier problem they had, which it says, you're not coming together for the right reason. Verse 20, therefore when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, okay, they're coming together. Oh, yes, we are. No. What you're doing, that's not the Lord's Supper. He explains why. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What, do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. They had turned it into a potluck for the privileged. Okay? That is, both its purpose was wrong, and by being exclusive, they weren't providing for anybody else who didn't have anything. So it was wrong on multiple fronts. So now he's bringing that back into the conversation and closing things off here at the end to make sure they understand he hasn't forgotten that. This is part of the correction, is that if you're coming to eat, you're doing it the wrong way. You take care of that another way. You do that at home. He's not saying that you couldn't eat and drink in the building. He's saying what you're doing is you're bringing this, making this a social function. You've got plenty of opportunities for that. This is different, and you need to treat it as something that is different. Let him eat at home. You can do that somewhere else. Lest you come together for judgment now. What did he just said earlier? Verses 31 and 32. Judgment is that when you're doing the wrong thing, the wrong way, you're going to be judged for it. Okay? There's going to be correction applied. God's looking down and saying, that's not right. So there's going to be correction. He's basically saying you ought to expect correction. You know, there's a difference between a child who is just kind of oblivious to what's going on and they just need to be trained no, that's not how you do this. Let me explain. We do this. And the child who does something, who knows very well they're doing something wrong, and then they get caught. You know, the young ones have that look where they pretend like they didn't know. They knew all the time. No, that was the wrong thing to do. He's saying, no, you know the right thing to do here. You keep this up, you're going to be judged for that. You know better. I'm making sure you know better. And then we see this last phrase. And the rest I will set in order when I come. Yeah, that's a little ominous, isn't it? Because the question is, what is the rest? What had he set in order? Think about how long a stretch this is closing off. All the way back to chapter 8. That's quite a bit of territory he has covered here. So he's taken time to focus on the big items, their attitude toward and their behavior in things offered to idols. Then coming back specifically to even chapter 10, you come back and see that, but then he dealt with the wearing of the veils and now the Lord's Supper. Those are the big things. Now their attitudes toward the principle was, are you really thinking and doing things for the right purpose, for the right reasons, and for the salvation of souls, or are you just applying little selfish kind of motives in wanting to be your own little club? Which is it? So when he says, and the rest I will set in order when I come, there are more applications to this than what are stated. There are going to be more. But he's given enough. So we need to be aware, and I think as we've gone through the text, we did that, of noting the principle and then being able to pull out and see in our situation to make sure that we are following this principle of doing the right thing to do what God wants us to do, that we then make sure that among those things we're aware of how it affects other people. We're not going to stop doing what God requires because someone has a problem with it. But if there's something that God doesn't require but that's allowed, but that's going to create a problem here. I don't want to create a problem for somebody. Why? Because I love them. And I want them to go to heaven. And the beauty of this whole section is really demonstrating that kind of attitude. Because guess what happens when you don't have that? You get division. They were divided up for a number of reasons, but this attitude was a reflection of that selfishness of basically having all the people like me who are like me in other ways, we get along just fine. But if they're faithful Christians we have trouble getting along with, and we cannot be willing to make allowances for changes in our behavior for their benefit, then we aren't really applying the principles correctly. We're wanting to set a limit on our love, and we want to say that's not fair. And what we end up doing is applying kind of a political kind of approach to it of that's not fair. Okay, well, the question is it loving, not whether it's fair. And when we develop the kind of attitude that God has, we know it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair for Jesus to die on the cross. That wasn't fair. He did nothing wrong. It was the most loving thing ever done. Why? Because it was for everyone else and their benefit eternally. Now, if we are going to be like Christ, verse 1, imitate me as I also imitate Christ, then that attitude ought to come with it. All right. 27 minutes. That was the first 11 chapters. John, you're going to take me down, aren't you? You're just going to... Yes, sir. What can I do? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yes, they were. Yes, that's a good question and a good reminder. Yes, they were young Christians. Remember when we started that most likelihood they're still within the first 4 or 5 years of their Christianity. And they've got a limited access. They don't have the New Testament written down to read for themselves and study. This is kind of it. They get what they're getting weekly, and they're getting this. And so when you look at the Corinthians, I do think that we do them a disservice sometimes of why did they have these problems? Because they were carrying over the kind of attitudes and background they had before they became Christians. You know who doesn't do that? No one. Everyone does that. We spend our time maturing, and it is partly about continuing to shed the ideas that we brought in with us that don't belong. That's a lifelong kind of effort. Then we, at the same time, are building in new ideas that are Christian ideas. That's what he's doing here. He doesn't just get onto them and say, you're wrong, stop that. He said, I have to always, at this point, pause because Bob Newhart passed away. One of my favorite skits is Stop It. Y'all haven't seen it? Look it up. But stop it. That's not good enough. He's going to give them the explanation why. He's going to explain, here's what you need to do. You're divided up. Here's the problem. He transfers it onto himself. He takes the burden, kind of like Nathan did with David. He understood it'd be hard for David to hear immediately, so he kind of let the emotion develop another way before lowering the boom. Well, Paul transfers it all to Apollos and himself so they could get understanding without the emotions getting in the way, and then let them know so that they could have oh, you're doing this, you're the one. And we bring this along. each time he is combining the idea of what the correction is with the positive that will overcome the correction, and that they will be better off as a result, not just lacking. It's not just, correction is not just about we're going to pull out the bad. It needs to also include, here's the proper. Here's something good. Let's build and grow. And he's doing that for them too. Now, the fact that they were able to hear these things as, Christians of just a few years, take it in, make all these changes, that tells you something about them, that they were serious about their Christianity. They were ignorant, they were weak, confused on some things. Remember, a lot of this is questions they had. That's where a lot of these things are. These are questions. What are we supposed to do at the Lord's Supper? We got different ideas going on. Okay, let's straighten all this out. Okay. So, now let's take a look. We're going to turn to chapter 12 and just provide background, because we're now entering a new section, as we note by verse 1, which says, "Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I do not want you to be ignorant." Okay? So he's opening, and he's, okay, now we're moving on to the next big question. What about these things with spiritual gifts? Now, these questions likely were coming back from the household of Chloe. It says, we got this going on. This doesn't seem right to me. Can you help us out here? And so he's just kind of going along. And this section, we do not see another now concerning until you get to chapter 16. That would place chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15 all within this general framework, which is interesting because of including the chapter on the resurrection. But it makes sense. We supply the idea of spiritual gifts because that's pertinent to chapter 12. But in actuality, and that continues on, yes, chapters 12, 13, and 14 as an elaboration. But it really has to do, if you notice, gifts is not actually there. It's desire spiritual something, okay? The things that are spiritual. So it has the connotation, but it also, the resurrection itself, as an act of God, that is not something that was placed in man's hands, though. It still kind of falls into that same idea. So what are we going to see as we move forward in this section? Now he's got to straighten out, explain, and help them through some misunderstandings about these spiritual gifts. Hayden? Oh, I think that's a decent question. I think he has more something specific in mind, but you do have to consider the nature of the context. I mean, you're going to say the Lord's Supper isn't spiritual? No, I don't think so. Okay, so or the principles he's addressing? No. Reaching out and the question of whether or not you're going to love people? No. But he's really addressing those things that are of the Spirit, and as the one who is providing the means, that makes sense. And he's going to address that is by inspiration, by the miraculous. We read in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, that was done by means of the Holy Spirit. We see that also with Jesus in Matthew chapter 3, that the Spirit comes upon him even, that he is passing this on to the disciples. They are being acting even before Acts 2 by means of the Holy Spirit. He is designating that from Joel 2, when Peter quotes it in Acts 2, that it's from the Spirit. And therefore, all these things have to do with their origin of, therefore, being provided by and activated by the Holy Spirit. And that's the reason for the description. And it's more distinct in that it stands out because these are beyond the normal. Right? So here spiritual is being contrasted not with the others as being not from God, but rather the activities that are enjoined and require the Holy Spirit to do, remembering in the first century what we have. It was required. It's not a natural thing. So it's more the difference of something that was natural in the sense of men can do all these things, responsibilities, Here we're entering a section in which the Holy Spirit's involvement is key for any of these things to actually happen. And that's part of the issue going on. Now, in just to overview all of this as we begin to approach it, chapter 12 centers on the gifts themselves, okay? That's first, laying out the gifts themselves. And then on the problem associated with those gifts. Now, what do you think in Corinth would be the problem they would have because of having these gifts? Yeah, we're going to have division over who's got the coolest gift. No, really, that's what they had. They had a problem of division over who got the cool gifts, right? And what was the coolest gift? See. Jawohl. Yeah. Y'all got to keep up with me here. Yeah, the idea of being able to speak a different language was they put at the top. And he's going to correct that. He's going to correct that of why that's not the best and that they had the wrong idea. But you could understand it was the most dramatic. We tend to think of all these things being somewhat dramatic, but not all of them were. It wouldn't have some kind of flash to it. We're used to seeing the miracles that did, but we don't appreciate the fact that if you're speaking by inspiration, you're just speaking. The inspiration is proven by something else. Another thing that's flashier, right? That was kind of the thing, is that Peter in Acts 3, Peter and John are walking, they heal a lame man. That's flashy. That'll get your attention. The more important thing was the message that he spoke by inspiration. That's what they needed. Okay, so that's kind of part of the problem is whether or not you're drawn to the things of flash or substance. Well, you've got younger Christians, flash kind of like that flash, and that they're just following along, kind of like Simon, who'd been the sorcerer. He kind of liked that gift, right? He was a new Christian. That's cool. Trying to get past that. So it created problems of division, and what we're going to find is the way in which it's approached. Paul's pointing out, all of these things were created not to create division, but to create unity. So who's the problem here? That's chapter 12. Chapter 13, still in the context of the miraculous and these gifts, is motive. And then he goes in, we are very familiar with, right, the discussion about love. And that love being the right motive. What's more important, the most important thing is that you love. And that's not how you're approaching these gifts. These gifts exist to do something that is motivated by love. And you're not using it for that reason. That's not how it's approaching. And then he adds on in verses 8 through 10 of chapter 13, you need to understand that love is better. These things are going away. Love's the thing that endures in eternity. That's what you need to spend more time on. In chapter 14 then, he picks it up and talks about the practical use of these gifts within the assembly. And so as you go through, he is in actuality, chapter 14 is about leadership within the assembly. And he's correcting what they were doing using miraculous gifts, which had to do with the speaking roles and all those kind of things. But it included singing, it included prayer, included all those things. Those were included in this. And it was placed within the context, though, of limiting them from just kind of doing whatever they wanted. It was not to be a free-for-all. That's why he closes in chapter 14 with, let all things be done decently and in order. Well, that's what he had been laying out. Here are the rules for an orderly assembly. Now, we have to, when we go through, we discuss this passage, we're going to have to go through first and evaluate it and see its meaning within a first century context of a miraculous nature, and then move distinguishing the difference there of how does that look for significance in a 21st century world of no miraculous gifts. But the principles of the order of the assembly are still there. You have to extract the miraculous from it and then make the application. That gets you to chapter 15, which you should be familiar with, which is all about the resurrection. And what's interesting is that he's number one, he waits for that discussion and the fact that some would have trouble with the resurrection. But if you go all the way back to chapter 1, we find that both the Greeks and the Jews had trouble with the gospel because of the resurrection. That just didn't fit their framework of thinking. That seemed like just nonsense to them that could happen. You remember the reaction in Acts chapter 17 when Paul they were fine. The Epicureans and Stoics, they were fine listening to him until he got to the resurrection. And then they're like, yeah, no, can't go there. Well, if that's the problem all around you, and that makes you come across as being silly, uneducated, unintelligent, maybe you back off a little bit. So he waits and he's going to address that because you have, though, something that is supernatural. You see, all of these things he's addressing, for them, were within the realm of supernatural. And the resurrection is, with Jesus' resurrection and ultimately to ours, it's a supernatural thing. And these other things were smaller by far in comparison, but that's the broader context of all he's going to address. So when you look through this, the underlying problems of division, you still notice. You notice that they still have problems with attitude and love. Remember, that was the key element he's been building to, of caring about how it affects other people. That was this whole section we've just finished, was talking about that. Guess what that really is? Love. And that needed to apply in the realm of the spiritual gifts as well. So that they had let all these other things, kind of the fantastic elements, take, which is understandable early on, take a hold of them and not be developing the things of greater substance of character. And so he is moving his way through, because these things are still good. They were necessary and important. But he needed to build up their character for them to be truly effective in what they were doing, so that their faith would be on the right course. And that will complete that whole section. But we will come back next week, and we'll begin in earnest with chapter 12 and focus then on the miraculous gifts and developing both the nature of them, what they were given, and what the point was early on. I have no idea how far we'll get. As you know, that's always just, that's just always out there. So, but we will get to start chapter 12.